Cops demand a harsh sentence for Blake, but the USSS walks into court with a bombshell. "You lying thief. You think you can just steal people's money and walk free?" Iona barely had time to react before she was shoved against the hood of a police car. Cold metal snapped around her wrists. The officers didn't ask questions. They didn't wait for an explanation. To them, she was already guilty, accused of running a massive financial fraud scheme. Iona May's world collapsed in an instant. The police had evidence, bank records, surveillance footage, even witness testimonies. It all pointed straight to her. But there was just one problem. She had nothing to do with it. What happened next will make your jaw drop. A corrupt system, a hidden truth, and a fight for justice that no one saw coming. Stay with me, because this story takes twists you won't believe. And before we dive in, if you love real stories of justice, truth, and shocking revelations. 15 days earlier, Iona was leaving her job at Capital Harvest, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting food insecurity in low-income communities throughout D.C. She had stayed after hours coordinating a fundraiser that would help subsidize fresh produce for families in need. It was a job that paid little but fed her soul. Night had long since fallen by the time she locked up the small office. She recalled how the air felt heavy with humidity. It was the kind of night where the city's heat refused to dissipate. She hurried down the street, hoping to reach her car before her parking meter expired. Then she saw the flashing lights, red and blue, urgent and glaring. A police cruiser idled next to her vehicle. Thinking she might be ticketed for an expired meter, Iona approached with a mixture of anxiety and annoyance. But when the officer stepped out, Officer Owen Ross and his partner, Officer Eva Diaz, their demeanor was not that of two people handing out a minor citation. "Are you Iona Mace?" Ross asked, voice low but authoritative. Iona nodded, unsure what was happening. Within minutes, they began grilling her about fraudulent credit cards, illicit bank accounts, and a major financial scheme. The words rattled her. They made no sense. She explained that she had no idea what they were talking about, that there had to be a mistake, but her protests fell on deaf ears. Ross cuffed her with a certain relish that Iona had never before witnessed, an almost gleeful arrogance. The moment she felt the cold steel snap around her wrists, she realized her life would never be the same. They didn't even let her call her mother until after processing her at the precinct. By then, the gravity of her situation had fully hit her. The police claimed to have mountains of evidence linking her to credit card fraud and identity theft across multiple states. How that was possible, Iona had no clue, but she was too frightened to think clearly. She only remembered being fingerprinted, having her mugshot taken, and being placed in a holding cell that smelled of old sweat and bleach. When she was finally released on bail 2 days later, her public defender, Les Cook, told her grimly, "They've built an impressive case against you, but impressive doesn't always mean accurate. We'll have to fight this with everything we've got." From that moment, Iona's life revolved around hearing after hearing, preparing for the day when she would stand in front of a federal judge, and that day had finally come. 3 days before the trial, Iona found herself in Les Cook's cluttered office, a cramped room in the basement of a government building. Faded motivational posters lined the walls, and a single flickering fluorescent light made the dingy space feel even more oppressive. Les was a jaded but earnest public defender in his early 40s. He'd fought countless battles for clients who lacked the means to hire top-tier attorneys. He understood how the scales of justice often tipped against people of color and lower-income backgrounds. And now, staring at a mountain of prosecution documents, he frowned. "There's so much circumstantial evidence," he told Iona, gesturing at the thick binders. "They're painting you as the epicenter of this entire fraudulent enterprise, like you orchestrated multiple co-conspirators, set up illicit bank accounts, and did it all under the radar." Iona, sitting stiff-backed on a metal chair, was numb with disbelief. "But you know that's not true." Les nodded. "I do. But the prosecutors will point to deposit slips with your name on them, witness statements claiming they saw you making large purchases with stolen credit cards, and phone records that at a glance could imply you were in contact with certain criminal associates." She swallowed hard. "How do they even have that? My phone records, my deposit slips?" Once law enforcement suspects you of a federal crime, they can subpoena your financial and phone records. The key is to figure out what they're missing. If they had an ironclad case, they wouldn't keep burying us in reams of paper. Somewhere in there, I suspect, are the threads we can pull to unravel their story. That said, he added quietly, I won't lie. The district attorney's office is determined to make an example out of you. Iona tried to speak, but a lump formed in her throat. The notion of prison time years, or even decades hung over her like a vulture circling carrion. She clutched at the arms of the chair, thinking about her mother, her sister, and the family she tried to help at the nonprofit. Les seemed to sense her despair. We fight. That's all we can do, he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll cross-examine every witness, challenge every exhibit, and make sure no stone is left unturned. You have my word. Despite her terror, she nodded. I can't afford to lose. The courthouse's air conditioning blasted icy air across Iona's face as she entered the marble lobby on the morning of the hearing. A crowd of reporters, lawyers, and everyday citizens bustled around security checkpoints. She felt as though she were stepping onto a stage. Everyone's gaze seemed to pivot toward her. Her mother, Doris May, walked by her side, face etched with worry. Doris clutched a small Bible in her hand, lips pressed tightly together as if praying under her breath. Behind them came Donna, Iona's younger sister, who shot dark glares at any journalist who dared to approach. Les met them near the elevator bank, his arms full of folders. Ready? He asked gently. As ready as I'll ever be, Iona murmured. They boarded an elevator headed for the third floor, where Judge Rhonda Dale would preside. Iona had only heard bits and pieces about Dale, a tough jurist known for her no-nonsense approach and her impatience for grandstanding attorneys, but also rumored to be fair, a trait Iona prayed would manifest during her trial. Once inside the courtroom, Iona inhaled sharply. The pew-like benches, the looming judge's bench, the seal of the U.S. courts on the wall, it all felt surreal. She took a seat at the defense table, glancing at Les for reassurance. Across the aisle, 2 men and 1 woman comprised the prosecution team. Leading them was Assistant District Attorney Hazel King, an ambitious attorney rumored to be eyeing a run for higher office. Next to her sat Officer Ross and Officer Diaz. Ross wore a self-assured smirk while Diaz busied herself fidgeting with a pen. Iona's mind buzzed with dread. They looked so sure of themselves. When court opened, King stood for the prosecution's opening statement. She approached the jury box, which for the moment held only potential jurors during pre-trial motions, and cleared her throat with theatrical deliberation. Good morning, Your Honor, and good morning to everyone in this courtroom, she began, her voice carrying a certain polished confidence. We are here today to address a grave matter of financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The defendant, Miss Iona May, orchestrated a sprawling credit card scheme that defrauded innocent citizens, banks, and businesses of thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. King moved toward a large digital screen set up by the prosecution table. She flicked through slides that displayed images of credit cards, bank statements, and snapshots of an individual at ATMs. Although the images were somewhat grainy, we have compelling evidence that Miss May conspired with others to steal identities, open fraudulent accounts, and personally profit from these crimes. The question before us is not whether she did it, but how systematically and intentionally she executed this fraud. A hush fell over the room as she concluded. We will demonstrate that Miss May is the linchpin, the mastermind of this operation, and that a harsh sentence is warranted to protect the public from further harm. With that, King returned to her seat. Iona's face burned. Mastermind? She whispered bitterly. The term felt ludicrous given her modest life. Les stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the front for the defense's opening statement. His voice, though not as theatrically trained as King's, held steady compassion. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution calls Miss May a mastermind of fraud. But ask yourselves, what actual proof do they have? What you'll see today is a patchwork of circumstantial evidence and contradictory statements from so-called witnesses who think they saw Miss May. But keep in mind, the burden rests with the prosecution to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. He paused, scanning the faces in the gallery. There are glaring inconsistencies in the government's account, and we will methodically highlight them. We intend to show that Miss May is not the criminal genius the prosecution depicts. She is rather a victim of mistaken identity and possibly worse. Here, let's let the sentence hang, drawing attention to the possibility of police misconduct without directly accusing them just yet. His eyes flicked to Iona, then back to the judge. We ask you to keep an open mind and remember that the prosecution must meet a high standard of proof. We believe they will fail to do so." With that, he retook his seat. The first day of testimony involved a parade of prosecution witnesses. They called a local shop owner who alleged Iona purchased nearly $1,000 worth of gift cards with a stolen credit card. They presented a bank teller who claimed Iona deposited suspiciously large sums into multiple accounts within a span of 2 weeks. Each time, Les rose to cross-examine. "Are you absolutely certain it was Miss May who made this deposit?" He pressed the bank teller. "Did you personally see her face? Or are you relying on identification from a photograph shown to you by the police?" The teller hesitated. "I believe it was her." Les moved in for the kill. "Is there any photographic or video surveillance from that day that can confirm your memory?" The teller glanced nervously at King. "We didn't know. We don't have the tapes from that week anymore. They were overwritten." Les thanked the witness, letting the point sink in. No hard evidence, just a shaky recollection. Next, the shop owner took the stand, describing how nervous the woman buying gift cards seemed. "She kept looking around, wouldn't make eye contact. It raised red flags for me." Les responded, "People can be nervous for any number of reasons, Mr. Fields. How long was your interaction with the alleged customer?" The shop owner fidgeted. "Just a few minutes." "So you positively identified Miss May after those few minutes and a subsequent conversation with the police?" The man swallowed, appearing less certain. "Yes, they showed me her photo." Les's eyebrows lifted slightly. "So your certainty is based on a photo lineup conducted by law enforcement, correct?" The shop owner hesitated. "Well, yes." "Understood, thank you." Though these cross-examinations revealed weaknesses, the sheer volume of witnesses and the repetitive nature of their identifications began to weigh on the courtroom. For every shaky recollection, the prosecution hammered home the same narrative. Iona May was behind these transactions. They produced voluminous documents and wave after wave of statements, attempting to drown out the notion of her innocence through sheer quantity. When Officer Ross took the stand, he carried himself with a swagger that Iona found repulsive. His uniform was immaculate, his demeanor exuding confidence. "Officer Ross," King began, "can you describe for the court how you came to investigate Miss May for credit card fraud?" He cleared his throat. "Certainly. We'd been tracking a surge of fraudulent transactions involving cloned credit cards. In numerous instances, the compromised cards traced back to a network operating within the city. Miss May's name appeared repeatedly in our inquiries through suspicious accounts, tips from informants, and at least 2 witness identifications." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to hang in the air. "After compiling enough evidence, we sought a warrant for her arrest." Iona watched him, anger rippling through her veins. He spoke as if the case were rock solid. Where was this alleged evidence he kept referencing? King smiled. "What specific role did you determine Miss May played in these offenses?" Ross nodded. "We believe she was a central organizer. She coordinated with others to open accounts using stolen identities, and she handled transactions personally to avoid detection." King turned to Judge Dale. "I submit the investigation report, labeled Prosecution Exhibit HH14, as evidence of Miss May's direct involvement." Les rose calmly. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense requests voir dire on this exhibit's authenticity and chain of custody." Judge Dale peered over her glasses. "Sustained." "Officer Ross, can you verify the chain of custody for this report?" Ross hesitated just briefly and then nodded curtly. "All items were cataloged by me and Officer Diaz. The final iteration was viewed by our lieutenant before being sent to the DA's office. Everything is documented." Les approached the bench with a copy of the report, flipping through pages. "Officer Ross, I see no official timestamps here. Is there a reason these documents don't show when they were entered into the evidence log?" Ross tensed slightly. "Those details are in the department's internal database. We can provide them if necessary." Les looked to the judge. "It is necessary, Your Honor. We ask that the prosecution provide all relevant timestamps and logs before this exhibit is admitted into evidence." Judge Dale nodded. "I'm granting the defense's request. Prosecution, ensure that all relevant logs are provided by close of business today. We'll allow the exhibit conditionally, pending those documents." A flicker of annoyance crossed King's face, but she inclined her head. "Understood, Your Honor." With that settled, Ross continued testifying. He described phone records pointing to a series of calls he claimed were between Iona and known associates. However, The names of these associates were redacted in the police file, apparently for safety reasons. The entire performance felt orchestrated to paint Iona as a sly puppet master without giving the defense a fair chance to challenge the specifics. After Ross stepped down, the prosecution called Officer Eva Diaz. Compared to Ross's swagger, Diaz seemed nervous. Her eyes darted between King, Judge Dale, and the gallery where Iona's family sat. "Officer Diaz," King prompted gently. "You assisted Officer Ross in the investigation, correct?" "Yes," she said, voice trembling. "I helped compile witness statements and track suspicious transactions. I also accompanied him during Miss May's arrest." King drew out the next question. "Could you summarize Miss May's behavior during her arrest?" Diaz swallowed. She was quiet. She insisted she was innocent. She didn't resist physically, but she repeatedly claimed we had the wrong person. Did anything in her demeanor suggest she didn't understand the charges? Diaz paused, something akin to guilt flickering in her eyes. She seemed shocked. She kept saying there was a mistake. And was there a mistake? King prodded. Diaz stiffened, looking from Ross, who was glaring at her from the gallery, back to King. "I didn't see any evidence of that at the time," she finally said, her voice subdued. "We had probable cause." Les stood for cross-examination. "Officer Diaz, you mentioned witness statements that you compiled. Could you describe how you conducted these interviews?" She nodded meekly. "We visited locations where fraudulent transactions occurred and spoke to staff or bystanders who remembered the suspect. Were these photo lineups or in-person identifications?" "Some were photo lineups," she admitted. "And who created these photo lineups?" She hesitated. "Officer Ross created them, and I would often show them to witnesses." Les nodded, glancing at the jury. "Did you use any sort of standard police procedures or guidelines to ensure the lineups were not suggestive?" Her cheeks reddened. "Yes, we use standard procedures to the best of my knowledge." Les pressed on. "To the best of your knowledge, are you aware that the National Institute of Justice recommends blind administration of photo lineups, meaning the officer showing the photos shouldn't know which photo is of the suspect to avoid bias?" Diaz looked visibly uncomfortable. "Yes, I've heard of that. And did you follow that guideline in Miss May's case?" She fidgeted. "I can't say for sure. I often knew which photo was of Miss May because I was part of the investigation." Les waited a beat, letting the contradictions sink in. "So it's possible that the witnesses could have been influenced, intentionally or not, by your knowledge of which photo was the suspect." Diaz said nothing. After a drawn-out silence, she mumbled, "It's possible." A rustle of disapproval spread through the courtroom. Iona's heart flickered with hope. For the first time, the prosecution's case seemed vulnerable to real scrutiny. The next recess found Iona pacing a small lounge area outside the courtroom. Her mother and sister tried to comfort her, but she was too tense to sit still. Les approached, looking pensive. "I noticed Officer Diaz's reactions. She's uncomfortable, as if she's holding back. There's tension between her and Ross. That might be a crack we can exploit." Iona frowned. "Exploit how?" Les lowered his voice. "If she's feeling guilty, she might be susceptible to revealing more inconsistencies, or maybe she suspects they pinned this on you unfairly, but hasn't found a way to speak up. Keep an eye on her." Iona nodded, though the idea of people exploiting guilt about her false prosecution made her stomach twist. Still, if that was what it took to clear her name, so be it. Nearby, Officer Ross stood by a vending machine, glaring in Iona's direction. The intimidation was palpable. She felt her skin prickle under his gaze. He seemed almost smug, as if certain that no matter what the defense did, the system would side with law enforcement. When court reconvened, King introduced financial expert Dave Colby, who specialized in analyzing transaction patterns. Colby took the stand with an assured air, adjusting his tie before launching into a technical explanation of how the fraudulent activity was traced. After analyzing multiple clusters of credit card charges, Colby said, "We correlated purchase timestamps with local ATM surveillance. In several cases, the suspect wearing a hooded sweatshirt or a cap entered ATM vestibules just minutes after these fraudulent purchases. We believe the suspect to be Miss May." Les leapt to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is making a direct identification without sufficient personal knowledge." Judge Dale nodded. Sustained. "Mr. Colby, you may testify to your findings, but refrain from personal identification unless you have first-hand evidence." Colby nodded. "Understood, Your Honor." Let me clarify. In our analysis, the same phone number was often used to set up text alerts for these accounts. The phone number is registered to Miss May's address. Iona's heart hammered. She remembered losing her phone months ago. Had someone used her phone number or ported it to a new SIM card? She told the police as much, but they had seemingly dismissed that possibility. The prosecution displayed a colorful chart on the overhead monitors, illustrating how multiple purchases and deposits clustered around Iona's phone number. While the data looked damning, Les noticed a glaring omission. They didn't show the IP addresses or device details. During cross-examination, Les pounced. "Mr. Colby, are you aware that phone numbers can be spoofed or that phone service can be transferred to different devices using publicly available software?" Colby paused. "I'm aware that it's technically possible, but it's not common." Les continued. "In your report, did you account for the possibility that Miss May's phone number could have been compromised?" Colby shrugged. "We didn't see a direct indication of that in the billing records." Les gave a grim smile. "But you also didn't investigate thoroughly, correct?" Colby's jaw tightened. "We looked at the data we had." "Thank you," Les said, turning away, leaving the lingering impression that the prosecution's evidence was incomplete. The following day, the prosecution called additional witnesses, mostly small business owners and bank employees repeating the same story. They believed they saw Iona or someone who looked like her participating in fraudulent activities. Yet each cross-examination by Les chipped away at their certainty. Memories seemed foggy, dates blurred. It became clear that law enforcement had helped many of these witnesses identify Iona from a limited pool of photographs. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Iona overheard a hushed argument between Officer Ross and Officer Diaz. Ross hissed, "You'd better stick to the story or you'll regret it." Diaz looked on the verge of tears, but she said nothing, rushing into the restroom when she noticed Iona watching. A shiver ran down Iona's spine. What exactly is she afraid of? Later that afternoon, an unexpected twist occurred. One of the courthouse clerks discreetly approached Les. "There are some sealed affidavits that were never logged into evidence," she whispered. "I heard them mentioned in passing by the prosecution team. You might want to file a motion to unseal anything relevant." Les's eyes widened. Thank you. Are you sure?" She nodded solemnly and hurried off. Les wasted no time drafting a motion to compel the prosecution to disclose all sealed affidavits related to the case. Judge Dale scheduled a hearing on the motion for the next morning, setting the stage for what would become a turning point in the trial. Morning broke with a tangible tension. The gallery was fuller than ever. Word had spread that the defense was making a serious challenge to the prosecution's transparency. Even local TV stations were sending cameras and reporters. Iona's stomach churned with nerves as she entered the courtroom. She saw King conferring with Officer Ross and another official from the district attorney's office. Their faces were grim. Meanwhile, Les flipped through notes, his expression resolute. As soon as the session began, Judge Dale addressed the motion. "Mr. Cook, you assert that the prosecution may be withholding exculpatory material in sealed affidavits. Do you have any tangible proof?" Les cleared his throat. A credible source within the court staff indicated that affidavits exist which were not entered into the official record. If they relate to Miss May's case, they could be exculpatory or at least relevant under Brady versus Maryland. King stood. "Your Honor, we have no knowledge of any such affidavits. This is a baseless fishing expedition." Judge Dale frowned. "Nevertheless, the defense is entitled to review any material that might be exculpatory. I will order a brief in-camera review of the sealed documents by this court. If anything pertains to Miss May, I'll decide on disclosure." With that, the judge signaled for a short recess so she could examine the sealed files and chambers. Iona's heart pounded. An eerie sense of anticipation filled the air. Ross and King exchanged anxious whispers. Diaz stared at the floor, her face pale. 15 minutes later, Judge Dale returned, visibly perturbed. She cleared her throat, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "In my review," she said, "I found an affidavit provided by an unnamed source, someone within law enforcement, that raises serious questions about the methods used to identify Miss May as a suspect. The affidavit indicates that certain officers may have manipulated or outright fabricated witness identifications." A collective gasp sounded. Iona's pulse thundered in her ears. Could this be the break we need? The judge continued. "I am unsealing this affidavit under the court's discretion. The defense and prosecution will both receive copies, and I expect an immediate explanation from the prosecution as to why this document was not previously disclosed. King sputtered, "Your Honor, I had no knowledge. This must be an internal matter the officers kept hidden. My office did not intentionally withhold any evidence." Judge Dale's displeasure was clear. Whether it was intentional or not, this is a severe violation of discovery obligations. I'm granting the defense leeway to explore the contents of this affidavit and to recall witnesses as necessary. With that, the gavel struck. Court was adjourned for the day, but the air crackled with the promise of upheaval. Back in Les's office, he and Iona pored over the unsealed affidavit. It was heavily redacted, but the core allegations were explosive. I observed that certain officers within the police department coerced or groomed witnesses to identify Iona May as the suspect in multiple credit card fraud incidents. Witnesses who expressed uncertainty were told to think again or shown Miss May's photo repeatedly until they acquiesced. Some deposit slips alleged to be in Miss May's name were never conclusively verified by forensic handwriting experts despite departmental policy requiring such verification in major fraud cases. The statement went on to mention internal emails referencing Miss May as a convenient suspect with explicit instructions to shut down any inquiries about alternative leads. Iona felt both relieved and furious. "So they knew," she said, voice quivering with rage. "They knew I wasn't the right person, but they pinned this on me anyway." Les set the affidavit on the desk. "It certainly seems that way. The question is, who wrote this, and can we get them to testify?" Iona swallowed. "Do you think they'd risk coming forward publicly?" Les exhaled. "Hard to say. Whistleblowers in police departments often face retaliation, but we might not need them to appear if we can prove the statements are true. This gives us a strong footing to argue the entire investigation is tainted." Iona's eyes brimmed with tears. "Thank you," she managed, wiping them away. "I was starting to lose hope." He nodded, patting her hand gently. "We've still got a fight ahead of us, but we have something we didn't have before: a path to discredit the core of their case." Armed with the new affidavit, Les moved to recall Officer Ross and Officer Diaz to the stand under new subpoenas. King objected vehemently, accusing the defense of grandstanding and wasting the court's time, but Judge Dale overruled, stating that in light of the newly unsealed document, it was imperative to question the officers again. Iona felt her pulse quicken when Ross re-entered the witness box. He seemed more tense than before, his bravado tempered. As soon as he was sworn in, Les approached. "Officer Ross, do you recall an internal directive from your department that specifically labeled Miss May as a suspect worth pursuing despite a lack of direct physical evidence?" Ross's lips formed a thin line. "I'm not aware of any such directive." Les produced a printed section of the affidavit, redactions covering names, but clearly referencing Ross's unit. "Then could you explain why this affidavit suggests you manipulated or coerced witness identifications to implicate Miss May?" Ross's face reddened. He shot a glance at King, who seemed equally flustered. "That document is hearsay provided by an anonymous source. It means nothing without context, perhaps." Les allowed. "But combined with the testimony of your partner, Officer Diaz, who admitted to not following blind lineup procedures, it suggests a pattern. Isn't that right?" Ross shifted in his seat. "I did what was necessary to apprehend a suspect. I didn't force anyone to identify Miss May." "That's an outrageous claim." Les turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we request that the court instruct Officer Ross to produce any internal emails or communications that reference Miss May as a convenient suspect. We believe these are critical for the truth-finding process." Judge Dale nodded curtly. "Officer Ross, you are hereby ordered to submit all relevant communications from your departmental email and any inter-office memos concerning Miss May immediately." A flicker of alarm crossed Ross's features. Still, he responded with a curt, "Yes, Your Honor." Next, Officer Diaz was recalled. She took the stand, hands visibly shaking. King seemed to hold her breath as if afraid of what Diaz might say. Les walked up to the witness box, gaze steady. "Officer Diaz, you previously testified that you administered some of the photo lineups, and that standard blind procedures may not have been followed. Is that correct?" Her voice emerged as a whisper. "Yes." Les nodded. "In light of this newly revealed affidavit, Do you have any additional information about how Miss May became the primary focus of your investigation despite the lack of direct physical evidence tying her to the crime? She glanced at Ross, who was glaring daggers from the gallery. After an agonizing pause, she spoke, voice trembling. I had doubts. We collected statements from some witnesses who said the suspect was taller or heavier than Miss May, but Officer Ross insisted those statements were unreliable. Then we got the tip about Miss May's phone number. After that, it was like all other avenues stopped being explored. A ripple of whispers tore through the courtroom. Les leaned in. Are you suggesting that Officer Ross deliberately ignored or dismissed contradictory witness descriptions? Diaz nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. He said we needed to close this case quickly. There was a lot of pressure from the top. When I tried to bring up the discrepancies, he told me to keep quiet if I knew what was good for me. What about the deposits with Miss May's name? Did you ever see any proof that Miss May physically signed those slips? Diaz wiped her eyes. No. We never did a handwriting analysis. We just assumed it was her because the account was under her name, but Miss May's driver's license wasn't scanned at the teller window. We didn't confirm it was her in person. Let's let the significance of that sink in before continuing. Officer Diaz, do you believe Miss May could be innocent? Yes, Diaz said, choking back a sob. I do now. In the gallery, Iona felt her heart twist. This confession was both validating and heartbreaking proof that an officer had likely known the truth, but stayed silent out of fear. Judge Dale's face was impassive, but her eyes flashed with anger, clearly outraged at the revelation. King stood looking furious. Objection, Your Honor. Officer Diaz's beliefs about the defendant's guilt or innocence are not relevant. She isn't an expert. Judge Dale shook her head. Overruled. The witness's testimony speaks to the integrity of the investigation. Continue, Mr. Cook, but move swiftly. Les nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. Diaz stepped down from the stand, tears glistening. Ross refused to look at her. Iona could practically taste the tension in the air. The lunchtime recess that day was unlike any other in Iona's memory. She barely tasted the sandwich her sister handed her. Everywhere, people whispered in hushed tones about Officer Diaz's confession and the affidavit. Even the reporters who had previously cast her in a suspicious light now seemed eager for her side of the story. This is huge, Les told Iona as they stood outside the building, inhaling fresh air. Between Diaz's testimony and the affidavit, we're making serious headway. The judge can see the case is riddled with inconsistencies. Iona nodded, tears of relief slipping down her cheeks. I'm scared to hope too much. Les looked at her kindly. Keep the faith and keep an eye out. There might be more unexpected turns. They returned to the courtroom where King appeared ready to salvage what remained of her case. She moved on to call a forensic specialist who claimed that traces of Iona's digital information were found linked to certain fraudulent card applications. But Les, now armed with Diaz's admissions, hammered the specialist on cross-examination about whether those digital traces could have been part of an identity theft scheme. Yes, it's possible, the specialist finally conceded, but not highly probable in my personal opinion. Your personal opinion is not evidence, Les reminded the court. Just speculation. The cross-examination ended with the specialist looking deflated. The once confident posture of the prosecution now looked battered and uncertain. With the prosecution's case wobbling, a stir in the back of the courtroom drew everyone's attention. A tall, solemn man in a dark suit stepped inside, flanked by two more individuals dressed similarly. Their polished shoes clicked loudly on the marble floor. They wore badges that read U.S. Secret Service. Agent Earl Myers, the man in front, quietly took a seat behind the defense table. He didn't say a word, but his presence alone caused a wave of curiosity. Even Judge Dale leaned forward, eyeing him with a mix of intrigue and caution. Iona exchanged looks with Les, who shrugged, perplexed by the federal agent's unexpected arrival. King frowned, clearly uneasy. Officer Ross looked downright alarmed. Once the day's proceedings ended, Agent Myers approached Iona, and Les, may I speak with you in private? Les hesitated, glancing at Iona for approval. She nodded, and they stepped into a side hallway. Myers introduced himself formally. I'm Agent Earl Myers with the U.S. Secret Service Financial Crimes Division. We've been working on a multi-state ring of identity thieves. Your name, Miss May, popped up in our data, but not as a suspect. Rather, we believe you were a victim of identity theft. Iona's breath caught. Victim? Myers nodded. Yes, the phone number that local police tied to you actually first appeared in a data breach we've been tracking. We suspect a criminal group used your personal information, likely gleaned from a stolen or cloned phone, to open fraudulent accounts. We've compiled surveillance footage, IP logs, and other evidence that suggests you were never physically present for most of these transactions. Iona's knees nearly gave out. The sense of vindication was dizzying, but also enraging. That means everything they accused me of, Myers nodded, is likely false. We requested to review the local police investigation, but we discovered crucial discrepancies in their reports. This is why I'm here. I plan to provide the court with the evidence we have as it directly impacts your case. Believe me, we don't typically involve ourselves in local investigations, but this situation demands it. Les's eyes lit with cautious excitement. We're set to reconvene tomorrow morning. If you can testify, Myers cut him off gently. We can do more than that. We have tangible proof that Miss May's identity was compromised months ago. It should exonerate her fully. Iona stared at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. I can't believe this is happening. Myers offered a sympathetic smile. I only wish it had happened sooner. The next morning, the atmosphere was electric. The prosecution, clearly rattled, tried to push forward with additional minor witnesses, bank employees who'd mentioned seeing someone who might match Iona's description, but the entire courtroom's attention remained fixed on Agent Myers and his colleagues, who sat quietly until the judge recognized them. Finally, Les rose and formally requested the court's permission to call Agent Earl Myers as a defense witness. King objected, claiming this was last minute and could disrupt the trial. Judge Dale overruled, stating that the pursuit of truth outweighed procedural inconvenience. Agent Myers took the stand, looking every bit the methodical professional. After the court clerk administered the oath, Les began direct examination. Agent Myers, please state your role and involvement in financial crime investigations in the U.S. Secret Service. I specialize in uncovering complex identity theft and credit card fraud rings. We track illegal operations, often spanning multiple states. Les nodded. And how does Miss May fit into one of your investigations? Myers explained, his voice steady and clear. Our data revealed that Miss May's personal information, including her phone number, likely became compromised during a data breach. We discovered fraudulent credit card accounts opened under her identity in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York, often used within hours of each other. He paused to let that sink in. The local police's theory that Miss May physically traveled to all these locations to make purchases is not supported by our timeline or the surveillance we've gathered. At that, he inserted a USB drive into the court's display system. A monitor showed side-by-side images of a woman at an ATM in Philadelphia and another wearing a hooded sweatshirt in Baltimore. Both images were time-stamped. Observe the height measurements relative to the ATM keypad, Myers pointed out, and the broadness of the shoulders. Both differ significantly from Miss May's known physical stats. We used advanced facial recognition algorithms that only returned a 38% match to Miss May, far below the threshold for positive identification. A stunned silence took hold of the courtroom. Even the judge seemed riveted. Les asked, so is it your professional opinion that Miss May was not the individual conducting these transactions? Myers nodded. That's correct. King was practically squirming as she rose for cross-examination. Her tone was clipped. Agent Myers, are you aware that Miss May's phone number appears repeatedly in bank security logs corresponding to these fraudulent deposits? He replied calmly, yes, which is the hallmark of identity theft. Her phone number and other personal details were likely spoofed or cloned. King pressed on, isn't it possible Miss May was working with co-conspirators, lending them her phone or using multiple devices to throw off investigators? Myers didn't flinch. We found no evidence of Miss May's direct involvement. In fact, her official phone records show no data usage consistent with the transaction timestamps. Instead, we see that the phone number was ported to another device, one that Miss May did not own. King attempted a new angle. Could you have made an error? Identity theft investigations can be complex, and maybe you missed something? Myers smiled politely, exuding confidence. We cross-referenced multiple databases and conducted interviews with informers. The suspect is part of a known ring that used Miss May's details. Our investigation is ongoing, but I'm quite certain Miss May is not a perpetrator. He turned to the judge. I'm prepared to submit copies of our digital forensic analysis and internal memos. This should clarify the matter for the court. King's face hardened, realizing the damage. She switched tactics. No further questions, she mumbled, stepping away. The gallery buzzed. Iona saw the color drain from Ross's face. Officer Diaz sat at the edge of the bench, eyes downcast. Judge Dale, however, was unreadable. She simply said, "I will allow the defense to admit these documents. Court is adjourned for a short recess while I review them." A crescendo of chatter erupted as spectators rose to stretch their legs. Iona found herself wiping tears of relief, finally proof. When court reconvened, the judge's expression was grimly resolute. She peered over her glasses at the assembled parties. "I've examined the Secret Service's evidence," she said. "It is extensive and highly suggestive that Miss May did not commit the fraud for which she's been charged. Furthermore, it raises serious concerns about the thoroughness and possibly the integrity of the local police investigation." A hush fell over the courtroom. In the back, a cluster of reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Judge Dale continued, "Given these revelations, Miss King, I assume the prosecution would like a chance to reassess its position." King stood, her voice subdued. "Yes, Your Honor, the district attorney's office needs time to reconcile this new information and determine if we can still proceed with the case." Les rose immediately. "Your Honor, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against Miss May. This new evidence exonerates her." King bristled. "We don't agree that it fully exonerates her. We just learned of it." Judge Dale held up a hand, silencing the argument. "I will give the prosecution until the end of the day to decide whether they can proceed or if they will dismiss. Any attempt to prolong this without strong justification will be denied. We are talking about a defendant liberty here." With that, the judge declared a recess until the afternoon, giving the district attorney's office a brief window to review Agent Myers's materials. During the recess, Iona stepped into the hallway, escorted by her sister and mother. The sense of relief was palpable, but so was the tension. Officers Ross and Diaz stood by a water fountain. Ross was whispering angrily, though Diaz seemed to be ignoring him, shoulders hunched. At the opposite end of the hall, King conferred with a high-ranking official from the DA's office. Their expressions were grim. Iona felt their eyes flick to her, as if measuring her for the last time. Eventually, Officer Diaz approached Iona hesitantly. "Miss May," she began, her voice trembling. Iona's sister Donna opened her mouth to snarl at the officer, but Iona gently held her back. "You knew I was innocent?" Diaz's eyes welled. "I suspected it. Mills told me we had to push forward with you as the suspect, or we'd lose the case and get heat from above. I should have spoken up, but I was scared." Iona felt anger surging, but also pity. The system had coerced Diaz just as it was trying to break her. "I appreciate you telling the truth now," she said softly, "but you almost cost me everything." Diaz could only lower her head, tears falling silently. Without another word, she walked back to the courtroom, leaving Iona to grapple with the swirl of emotions. When the court resumed, King addressed Judge Dale in a subdued tone. "Your Honor, after reviewing the Secret Service materials, we find that the prosecution cannot definitively link Miss May to the fraudulent transactions. We concede that there are serious credibility issues with the initial police investigation." She paused to swallow what appeared to be a lump of professional pride. Accordingly, the district attorney's office moves to dismiss all charges against Iona May in the interest of justice. A burst of emotion erupted from the gallery, gasps, murmurs, and the quiet sob of relief from Iona's mother. Iona felt her knees go weak. Tears streamed down her face. This was it, freedom. Judge Dale tapped her gavel lightly. "Miss May, please stand." Iona stood, heart hammering. "Based on the prosecution's motion and the evidence presented, this court dismisses all charges against you with prejudice. The record shall reflect your exoneration. Furthermore, I will be recommending that the Department of Justice and Internal Affairs undertake a thorough review of the police conduct in this case." The judge's stern gaze flicked to Officer Ross, who slumped in his seat, and then to Diaz, who stared at the floor. "We cannot tolerate any law enforcement behavior that undermines justice or leads to wrongful accusations." With a final rap of the gavel, Judge Dale declared the case closed. Within minutes of the dismissal, the courtroom transformed into a chaotic swirl of relief and outrage. Half the reporters rushed to Iona, microphones raised, others cornered King or Officer Ross for a statement. Iona's mother wept openly, hugging her daughter as Donna joined them. Les looked near tears himself, though he tried to maintain a professional composure. "Justice is served," he whispered, patting Iona on the back at last. Outside on the courthouse steps, a swarm of cameras and journalists clamored for Iona's perspective. She stood there, the sunlight feeling warmer than it had in weeks, feeling as if she just emerged from a dark tunnel. I'm relieved, she managed, her voice shaky. I'm grateful to Agent Myers and the Secret Service for bringing the truth to light, but I'm also angry that I was ever here in the first place, that local police decided to make me a scapegoat. Reporters jotted notes feverishly. One asked, Miss May, will you pursue legal action against the police department? Iona hesitated, glancing at Les. He nodded slightly, indicating that was an option. I might, she said, determination in her voice. I lost my livelihood, my peace of mind, and my reputation was dragged through the mud. Something needs to change so this doesn't happen to anyone else. In the ensuing weeks, the scandal rocked the local police department. Internal Affairs launched a probe into Officer Ross, discovering multiple instances where he disregarded exculpatory leads to boost his clearance rate. He was placed on administrative leave, and rumors swirled that criminal charges, possibly obstruction of justice, were forthcoming. Officer Diaz, in an attempt to atone, cooperated fully with investigators. Her willingness to testify against Ross might spare her from severe disciplinary action, but her career in law enforcement was effectively over. She resigned, citing personal reasons and expressing regret for her role in the injustice. King faced her own reckoning, though she claimed ignorance of the withheld evidence. The public outcry demanded accountability. The district attorney's office faced lawsuits and public hearings regarding its oversight of police investigations. King continued her role, but her once promising political aspirations were tainted by the scandal. Meanwhile, Captain Colton, who had once appeared on local TV boasting about the case, made a hasty exit from the department. Officially, he retired. Unofficially, many speculated that the department forced him out to avoid further tarnishing their image. Iona was free, but the psychological scars remained. She found herself grappling with panic attacks, nightmares of being back in that holding cell. At the same time, her community rallied behind her. People who once suspected her innocence or guilt now realized the precariousness of any person's fate when a system veers off course. Her employer at the nonprofit welcomed her back, albeit with caution, acknowledging the media storm around her. Over time, though, Iona found that returning to her old routine offered a sense of stability. Distributing fresh produce, teaching low-income families about nutritional cooking, these tasks grounded her, reminding her there was life beyond the courthouse. Yet she could not forget the ordeal. Encouraged by Les, Iona began speaking at local colleges, community centers, and justice reform panels about her experience. She detailed the terrifying ease with which a person could be branded a criminal, the trauma of being in jail, and the relief when the truth finally surfaced. At one such event, Agent Myers joined her on stage as a guest speaker. He reiterated the importance of thoroughly investigating identity theft cases. Iona May is the perfect example of someone whose stolen identity nearly cost her everything, he said to the crowd. We must ensure law enforcement, both local and federal, communication openly and ethically. Iona smiled faintly, the memory of the trial still fresh in her mind. I hope my story helps someone else, she replied to the crowd, voice steady. No one should have to go through what I did. A few months later, after careful deliberation, Iona filed a civil lawsuit against the city and the police department, citing wrongful arrest, malicious prosecution, and violations of her civil rights. The city's legal team attempted to settle quickly, wanting to avoid a public trial that would reopen the department's misconduct to intense scrutiny. Initially, Iona hesitated. She wasn't interested in a payday as much as ensuring reforms took place: better training on photo lineups, mandatory oversight for financial crime investigations, transparent collaboration with federal agencies when needed. When the city offered a settlement, she demanded they include provisions for these reforms. The negotiations dragged for weeks, but ultimately the city agreed to a substantial financial settlement and a set of policy changes designed to minimize wrongful arrests. The police department promised to retrain officers on proper investigative techniques for identity theft cases, including the blind administration of photo arrays, a direct reflection of what had gone wrong in her case. While no amount of money could undo the damage, Iona found solace in knowing her ordeal would leave a constructive impact, a small but meaningful shift in the system that nearly destroyed her life. On a warm spring afternoon, Iona found herself once again walking up the broad steps of the E. Barrett Prettyman United States Courthouse. This time, she wasn't here under duress. She had been invited to speak at a symposium on legal reforms, addressing an audience of young attorneys and law students. She paused at the top of the steps, gazing over the plaza. A memory flashed: the day of her trial, the crowd of reporters, the fear that had gripped her. It felt surreal to stand here, now not as a defendant, but as a respected advocate for justice. Inside, she joined a panel that included Les Cook, a representative from the Department of Justice, and a few local community leaders. They discussed better coordination between local and federal agencies, the importance of verifying evidence, and the ethical obligations of prosecutors to share exculpatory information. When it was Iona's turn to speak, she inhaled deeply and let her gaze travel over the attentive faces. "I was once on the other side of this system," she began. "I learned how a single mistaken assumption, a false identification, could spiral into a near catastrophe. The justice system is only as good as the people who uphold it. When officers cut corners or prosecutors ignore red flags, innocent lives can be shattered." She paused, her tone softening. "But I also learned the system can right itself when enough people demand integrity. I stand here as living proof that truth can still prevail, and I hope my story reminds all of you as future lawyers and leaders that justice should never be about winning or losing. It should be about finding the truth." Applause thundered across the conference room. Les caught Iona's eye and nodded proudly. For a moment, she felt an unexpected fullness in her chest, something like gratitude and defiance entwined. She had emerged from the darkness carrying a new light of purpose. As Iona left the symposium, she walked down the courthouse steps with a lighter heart. The stone columns no longer felt menacing. The entire place, once the setting of her worst fears, now stood as a testament to a justice system that, despite its flaws, could still be prodded toward righteousness. A gentle breeze ruffled her hair. She paused in the courtyard, recalling every harrowing detail: the chilling arrest, the fear-laden nights in a holding cell, the heartbreak in her mother's eyes, the shame of public suspicion, and finally the thunderous relief when the U.S. Secret Service unveiled the truth. Behind her, a reporter approached, camera crew in tow, asking for a quick comment. Iona turned, offering a modest smile. "I've learned that sometimes we have to fight for justice harder than we ever imagined," she said. "But that fight is worth it. And if it can change even one life beyond my own, then none of what I went through will have been in vain." The reporter nodded, turning off the camera. As Iona continued across the courtyard, she felt the intangible weight of her ordeal slowly lifting. In its place was a profound sense of purpose. She would never be the same, but she was in many ways stronger, a woman who had faced the full force of injustice and not only survived, but forced the truth to the surface. And so at the E. Barrett Prettyman United States Courthouse, the story of Iona may serve as both warning and inspiration, a demonstration that while power can be abused, courage and determination backed by incontrovertible evidence can bend the arc of justice back to where it belongs.